My invention was meant to illuminate the unconscious.
In a lab tucked above the streets of Taipei, a new kind of machine listens while we sleep, recording the language of our dreams.
Capture cycle complete. Neural patterns are stable.
This tiny capsule holds the whole dream?
Every moment, compressed and encrypted.
Ready to render.
Go ahead.
It's beautiful.
We built Nocturne to heal people, to let them see what was hidden and finally rest. But dreams don't stay still. They leak. They change.
3 dead in 2 weeks.
All with the device.
Someone's rewriting them.
If I go in after them,
Nocturne's Latency, a 4-episode techno-thriller told by a neurologist turned detective. Episode 1, Signal. On the evening the dream machine changed my life, Taipei was electric, humid air buzzing with scooters, LED billboards, and the sharp tang of impending rain. The press had already christened Insomnia's device Nocturne, as if it were a piano piece rather than a lattice of quantum diamond magnetometers, near-infrared sensors, and a web of machine learning pipelines stretched taut across the human brain. I had come to Insomnia as a consultant, not a believer. My name is Dr. Anya Hsu, neurologist by training, detective by necessity. After an accident 3 years ago took my younger brother into the slow fog of a coma and then away for good, I left the wards at Taipei Veterans General and folded my clinical logic into investigation, first for the medical ethics unit, then as an embedded expert with the National Police. Brains, bodies, motives, my work had narrowed to the slender spaces where science and intent touch. Insomnia's headquarters crouched in Hsinchu Science Park, glass, concrete, and the kind of tasteful teak that promises world-changing ideas at every whiteboard. A receptionist waved me past frosted doors into a space where the ceiling looked like a stripped-down forest canopy, cables descending like vines into a central room. "Dr. Hsu," said Ke Jianyu, the company's founder and chief architect, his smile the practiced calm of a man who spent hours smoothing investor worry. "We're honored. I'm told you don't scare easily." "Only by sloppy methods," I said. "And hype." He laughed as if grateful for the punctuation. "We have both," he said, "but less of the second." He led me through to a theater-dim test chamber. In its center sat a reclining chair with a helmet that wasn't, more crown than cap. It glimmered with chips the size of sugar crystals set in a flexible mesh. Beside it, a bank of equipment hummed, synchronized, labeled with tight acronyms and sharper hopes. QDM, OPM, MEG, NIRS, TFUS. A narrow VR headset, its foam pristine, perched like a waiting moth. "The core," Kay said, hand hovering over the mesh, "is an array of nitrogen vacancy centers in diamond. Quantum defects that act as magnetometers. They give us femtotesla sensitivity at millimeter scales, with bandwidth in the kilohertz range. That captures the magnetic whisper of ensembles, sometimes near the single neuron level when they synchronize. We fuse that with optical signals and high-bandwidth EEG. Non-invasive? I asked. Entirely, he said, except for consent. A tall woman in a linen blazer had been listening. Luo Sabrina, the CFO, the one who made numbers feel like weather. "Consent is our religion," she said. "We've built the company's compliance around it." "And around reconstruction," Kay said, picking up the thread he loved. "We trained Nocturne's decoders on paired invasive and non-invasive data from consenting epilepsy patients who already required ECOG. Then we transferred the mapping. Our model, palimpsest, learns an alignment between brain activity in latent space and a generative world model, Hypnos, that's been trained on multisensory experience. We call the bridge Dream Clip, though the lawyers hate the name. You map the living storm to a movie, I said, and then you replay it. Not a movie, he corrected. A walkable world, expressed as a simulation that renders to VR and haptics. He gestured to the reclining chair. Would you like to try it? I shouldn't have. I knew that even for a skeptic, curiosity can become a leash. But I also knew that nothing exposes the seams of a technology like wearing it. And there was the faint hope absurd and unprofessional that maybe, through precise instruments and glass channels, I'd glimpse a cleaner version of the night that broke my life. "What will you do with my data?" I asked. "Record a single night," Sabrina said. "Encrypt it with a key derived from your physiology and passphrases. The raw will be scrubbed. You can delete, you can refuse playback." "Playback is the point," Kay said softly. "But it's still your point." I lay back. The mesh settled. It was surprisingly light, the way good tools disappear when properly fitted. A technician named Avery Tu Dujiawei, thin with a gamer's posture and an engineer's careful hands, adjusted a strap, then touched my wrist. PPG, photoplethysmography, picked up my pulse to serve as a sync anchor. A subtle buzzing near my temples was TFUS, focused ultrasound, tracking my thalamic rhythms to tag transitions. "Your nightmare architecture is tidy," Avery said, reading my scalp topographies with the calm of a pilot. "You upregulate acetylcholine in REM but keep noradrenergic tone low. Good substrate for vivid recall." "Something I inherited," I said. I slept. In training, I had learned to fall asleep in hostile places, call rooms, ambulances, benches. But there was nothing hostile here, only a curious sense of being observed by a machine that had the tenderness of an attentive cat. I dreamed. In it, I stood in a corridor that looked like the hospital where my brother died, except the floor was a Taipei alley wet with rain and the walls were my grandmother's kitchen tiled in green. My brother, Wei, sat on a stainless steel gurney eating shaved ice sprinkled with peanuts, and I was both scolding him and laughing because his mouth was blue. A window opened on the sea near Tamsui, and I felt the suction of the tide. There were other fragments, bits of angry patients, an MRI scanner singing, the scent of antiseptic and sesame oil. An amber moth thudded against the light. When I woke, the lab lights were up to a comfortable dusk. The crown lifted. The world returned with the strange, clean brightness of a fever receding. "You did well," Avery said. "Your REM came in waves. We tagged 3 dream sequences with high semantic content." "What does that even mean?" I muttered, half smiling. "High semantic content?" "Coherence," Kay said. "Narrative density. Enough hooks for Hypnos to catch." I put on the VR headset. First came the dark, then the low hum that marks the edges of a virtual world. My inner ear readying, a shimmer in the noise as the machine tried to be an ocean. Then I was back in the corridor that was an alley that was a kitchen. The floor shone with rain. The tiles were my grandmother's green. My brother sat on a gurney eating shaved ice, and when he turned his face to me, his eyes were the same depthless black they had always been. He lifted a spoon and offered a bite with exaggerated gravity. "It's true," I said, voice unsteady, feeling it both in my throat and only in my mind. "You captured it." "It's your reconstruction," Kay said in my ear. "We're just rendering." I walked forward, each step a strange compromise between memory and physics. On the counter, there was a jar of dried plums, and a small alarm went off in my head. My grandmother had never kept dried plums in that kitchen. The jar bore a brand I remembered seeing in a shop near Shida years after she died. The simulation had borrowed a piece from another shelf of my life, a plausible detail to fill a coded gap. "You hallucinated this," I said, pointing. "We did," Kay admitted. "Palimpsest interpolates missing texture. We keep those additions tagged so you know what's invented. We're working to more explicitly mark them in the UI. But later in the shower, the tag bothered me. If the machine could fill a cavity in the dream from elsewhere in me, where else would it borrow? From the quiet places? From the things I didn't want to know? I signed the forms to see the data, as any good consultant would, and over the next week I lived at my desk with coffee and code. Euansomnia gave me access to the anonymized trace of my night, streams of numbers packed into chunks, headers scribbled with terms that might as well be poetry, hippocampal replay, spindle coupling, PFC phase locking, REM density. I traced the pipeline like a detective at a murder scene. The QDM array captured fields at microvolt equivalents. The EEG caught global rhythms. The NIRS tracked hemoglobin patterns. Palimpsest aligned these with a multimodal latent space, a vast set of learned vectors where images, sounds, and sensations coexisted as coordinates. The decoder mapped from the brain's dancing patterns to that latent space. Hypnos rendered the latence into an explorable simulation, which the VR stack streamed to my eyes at 90 hertz. Elegant, terrifying. On Friday morning, a courier delivered a black envelope. Inside was a single card printed with a lunar halo. Dreams belong to dreamers. Ye Ying, Nightjar, a signature from the dark web, a hacker, or a flock. I tucked the card into my notebook and told no one. I had learned to let warnings marinate. That night the storm finally broke. Lightning hit the hills above Hsinchu and the world blinked. At 2:07 a.m., the alarms at Yuansomnia's headquarters woke Security Chief Gao. Backup power kept the servers alive, but someone had danced through their perimeter like a matador. No hardware was missing. Nocturne's lab remained unmolested, but a sliver of code, small and surgical, had been altered in Palimpsest's encryption module. The key derivation function that braided biometric and passphrase had a new strand threaded through. Avery found it in the morning because excellence often looks like paranoia. Sabrina called me while I was still at Shilin Night Market buying guabao, and by the time I got to the lab, a whiteboard was an autopsy. "What's the vector?" I asked. "PPG," Avery said, tight-jawed. "They used our heart rate trace as part of the key." "They've bent it." Kay put both hands flat on the table. "Make me understand like a patient," he said to me, "not like a coder." "You used my pulse waveform to help build my key," I said. "Good, something intimate. But if someone can approximate that waveform, or worse, if they can trick the device into saving a derived version in logs, their attack surface grows. If they also injected a deterministic offset, then they might recompute keys for recordings if they intercept some metadata. "Can they open a vault without the owner?" Sabrina asked. "I don't know." I looked at Avery, who shook his head in a tiny movement that meant not yet. Nightjar had left no other footprints. Gao checked the cameras, the HVAC logs, even the candy machines. Nothing. 4 days later, on a karaoke bright Sunday, a celebrity woke to find her dream posted in a private Telegram channel with 3,000 members. She had consented to a study like I had without playback rights by contract. But a 30-second clip showed a primary colored room where she argued with a younger version of herself about a music producer, their voices distorted, their bodies stylized like avatars. The clip had a watermark. Dreams belong to dreamers. The channel's administrators called it a leak with purpose. They published a manifesto about consent and surveillance and the sanctity of night. Then, hours later, they posted a second clip, this one of a politician, fewer colors, more corridors. The press exploded. The stock dipped. Sabrina's face, usually a lake, broke into waves. Kay called me into his office. "I want you to investigate Anya," he said. "Formally. Not just the hack, but the company. If Nightjar is right about consent, if we've failed, tell me before the world does." "Reporting to whom?" I asked. "To me," he said, then added after a beat, "and to yourself." I agreed. I am not immune to audacity, especially when it asks to be held to account. I began with the cryptography, but as with most crimes, the key wasn't math, it was people. Yuansomnia was a beehive of competence. Engineers who spoke in Overwatch metaphors, neuroscientists who could quote both Kandel and Kawabata, therapists from Jungian to CBT, compliance officers knitting law into practice. But competence is not purity, and purity is not safety. I shadowed the therapy program, Deep Dream Integration, where dream VR replays were used under clinical supervision to unpack trauma. I sat with Dr. Liao Meilin, a Jungian with a calm voice and fierce hair, as she guided a patient through a revived childhood scene where a father's belt had sung. Tissues. Silence. Then, in the VR recap, she made sure the invented details were marked with halos. "We allow resonance but not confusion," she murmured. "Does it help?" I asked. It helps some, she said. But some patients, when given the power to revisit, twist the past until it's livable. Then they live there. In a glass-backed conference room with a view of a rain-polished parking lot, I met Professor Sato Yumi, an ethicist on loan from Tokyo. She had a way of asking questions that left no place for self-flattery to sit. "What is a dream?" she asked me. "A rehearsal," I said. "A filing system, a sideways problem solver, a mood regulator, a museum where the exhibits keep repainting themselves." "Then what is a captured dream?" she said. "A fossil," I said, "with some restored parts." "And when you show the fossil to the animal it used to be?" she asked. I had no answer. Or rather, I had too many. At the end of my first formal week, I took the train back to Taipei and walked through my old hospital's corridor. The floor was the right one, non-slip, beige, but my body remembered the dream's rain. I stood by the elevators and watched a doctor push a gurney past with a patient asleep under a pale blanket. I went home and slept. I did not replay my night. At 3 in the morning, my phone whined with a notification from an anonymous account. "Avery is in danger." Ye Ying, I jerked awake, the old drill of code blues in my legs. I called Avery. He answered on the second ring. "I'm fine," he said, voice hoarse. "What's wrong?" "I got a message." I hesitated, hearing his breath. "Lock your door." He laughed. "You sound like my mother." "You wish," I said, and hung up. The next day, Avery didn't come to work. Gao found him by noon, not dead, not missing, simply in a cheap hotel in Jubei, exhausted, a bottle of rice wine on the table and his laptop open to a thread of code I didn't recognize. I stayed in the hall while Gao spoke to him, then entered when Gao nodded. "They approached me," Avery said without preface, eyes too bright, "on an IRC channel. They asked me to help close the hole, Nightjar. They say they're not our enemy. They're the enemy of our future enemies." "Did you help them?" I asked. "I told them everything I could tell anyone," he said, "which is not much. I don't have the encryption keys. I can't touch the vault, but I know the interface. They knew already." "What did they ask for?" I asked. "A kill switch," he said, "in case the company sells replay rights to a third party. In case someone turns dreams into ads. Sabrina called that paranoid. Kay called it cynical. I called it a possibility." 2 nights later, the first Dream Bazaar went live, a dark market where anonymized dream clips could be traded for cryptocurrency. The rules were laughably moralistic. No faces without consent, no children, no blackmail, just the oniric equivalent of street photography. The clips were chaotic, often dull, sometimes sublime. A man dreamed of growing orchids from his fingertips. A woman imagined she was talking to a river. And then, inevitably, someone broke the rules. A banker's dream showed him counting money while a lover waited. The lover was recognizable. The lover's spouse called a lawyer. The lawyer called the press. And then the press called me. We were past the point of no return. The day Nocturne left the lab, it had already picked a side. The question now was who would claim the other. Episode 2. Mirror. "Dreams don't obey subpoenas," Dr. Liao said to me one morning as we watched a patient take off the mesh. "But now that we can fossilize them, the courts will try." "I'm not worried about the courts," I said. "I'm worried about the markets." We stood in a room that smelled like hospital air and new computers. A patient in his 60s adjusted his glasses and gave me the look patients always gave me when introduced to yet another specialist, fear masked as courtesy. "You'll protect me," he said to Liao, eyes slipping to me and away. "I'll try," she said. The company had activated a policy that required dual authorization for replays and new captures. It was a sensible antidote to panic, but it also slowed therapy. Liao's schedule gummed up, unreadable emails piled like driftwood. Nightjar posted another manifesto, this one less gentle. No more dream as advertising. No more replay without reciprocity. No more proprietary sleep. You tell a machine your night, it owes you its memory of you. "Ye Ying, we do owe them," Sabrina said in a management meeting. "But we also owe them safety." "We owe them the truth," Kay said. which is that we cannot guarantee what the world will do with this, only what we will do. And what is that? I asked. He looked at me for a long moment and didn't smile. We will not sell dreams, he said. We will build clinical tools and art tools. We will not become ad tech. We will not become law enforcement. We will not become a platform. What about demand? Sabrina said. What about therapists who want to prescribe dream curation? What about studios that want to license the hypnose renderer? What about patients who want to abandon the real night for a safer repetition of the old? We draw a line, Kay said. And we hope it holds, I added. It did not. The therapies began to ooze into the clubs. A company in Shinyi offered Lucid Ladder, a nootropically enhanced dream direction package that promised you'd meet your dead grandfather or your future self. It used certain legal and quasi-legal compounds, cholinergic promoters, orexin modulators, and an over-the-counter herb spiked with something that made your eyelashes hum, and paired them with dream phase auditory cues and a black market copy of a Hypnos-like renderer that was not Hypnos, but spoke the same dialect. The package's marketing was precise and shameless. Don't leave it to chance. Curate your night. You insomnia lawyers sent cease and desists. The club owners laughed. The police asked their favorite question, is it illegal? And got their favorite answer, it depends. One of Liao's patients, a woman named Hui, used Lucid Ladder the night before a scheduled clinical replay. She had 3 sessions with Liao for PTSD after a ferry accident. In her therapy dreams, the handrail always broke, the water was always too green, and somewhere distantly a flute kept playing a childish melody. That morning, in the controlled lab, Lucid Ladder still in the bloodstream, Hui's dream was different. The water was light, pouring through glass. The handrail held. The flute stopped. Liao was delighted. And then, halfway through replay, Hui's breathing changed. Too steady, too slow, then a stutter. She seized not like a typical convulsion, but like a brain fighting a pattern mismatch. We stopped the session. Her vitals recovered. But she left the lab a different person, quieter, edges smoothed. Her husband called 2 days later to say she had quit her job and started walking every night, down to the river, where she stood, unmoving, for hours. We changed something too fast, Liao said, eyes rimmed red. She found a false ending. I wanted to take Nocturne apart with a scalpel. Instead, I took my suspicions to code. The encryption scheme had not been my specialty. Math with teeth rarely is, but I could at least understand the shape of the animal. Insomnia claimed end-to-end encryption with keys derived from passphrases and biometrics, PPG. Nightjar's exploit thread had created a deterministic offset in the PPG waveform pre-processing. That meant that if you intercepted certain metadata and knew the offset, and if you could coax the player to reveal a piece of the decrypted payload by a timing attack, you could reconstruct the key. It was clever. I admired it without liking its consequences. What about the logs? I asked Avery. What's in them? Most of what you'd expect, he said. Session start times, checksums, model versions, error codes. And, I pressed, and a hash digest of the PPG seed for diagnostic replay, he said, wincing like a man pulling a bandage. Kay insisted we keep it at first because early beta testers kept losing keys. We planned to delete digests after rollout. We didn't. You didn't, I repeated. He looked ill. I didn't. I wrote the code. Kay knows, but it was my decision to keep it in a debug flag. What's the collision resistance? I asked. Strong, he said, but not infinite. Not if someone had access to the pre-image space reduction we use for speed. So Nightjar didn't even need to break the vault, I said. They needed only to tilt it and listen for the coins. Avery put his head in his hands. Tell me how to resign, he whispered, which is not an engineer's question. But sometimes we all need to be permitted to fail. First you fix it, I said. Then you resign if you still need to. That's the penance, as much as we ever get one in tech. We patched. The logs were scrubbed. The PPG offset was killed and entombed. We pushed a hard update to all clients. Nightjar mocked us in a post with a single gif of someone closing a barn door while the horse smoked a cigarette outside. I did not disagree with the metaphor. Then, on a hot Saturday afternoon, Dr. Liao Meilin died. They called me before the ambulance because physicians who reinvent themselves as detectives exist in the gray zone where hospitals and police overlap. Liao's apartment was in Dan, bookshelves, plants, a kettle that whistled a little too loud. She lay on her sofa with her eyes open and her expression so peaceful it hurt to see. There was no obvious trauma. A glass sat on the table with a slice of lemon in it. On the floor beside her couch was a notebook, its cover blue, with the Jungian mandala pressed into the leather. In another room, on her desk, a nocturne crown sat in its case. She had not used it. Or if she had erased signs the way good clinicians clean their trays. The medical examiner found a combination of sedatives and a designer cholinergic in her blood, plus a microdose of something novel that didn't map to any of the usual catalogues. Not enough to scream poisoning, enough to make the word influence stand up and adjust its shirt. Her notebook was worse. Inside were patient initials, dates, symbols that looked like a language between mathematics and mythology. Circles for dreamers, arrows for associations, triangles where she felt a pattern thickening. On one page, middle of the book, she had drawn a bird with its wings outstretched, stylized, black ink. Underneath, a single word, Ye Ying. Was she Nightjar? Sabrina whispered to me as if the dead could overhear. I shook my head. She was seeing the same pattern we are, I said. Dreams fleeing the lab. There were messages on Liao's phone she never answered, one from a client at 3 a.m. The dream keeps looping. I think I left something there. One from an unknown number. Meet me at the river. I have her file. One from Avery. Are you safe? I looked at Key. She knew something, I said, or someone needed us to believe she did. By Monday, the Dream Bazaar had a new category, curated. In it, dreamers advertised experiences shaped by pharmaceuticals and closed-loop stimulation, climb a mountain of paper, talk to a childhood dog, speak with God, and get a plausible answer. Their pitches were pornographic without being sexual. They promised closure in a market that could never deliver it. We took the train to Tainan because Avery had a hunch, and sometimes the best science is simply listening to a person who loves their work. He had traced a fork of palimpsest to a cluster of IP addresses that lived behind a university, but behaved like a ghost kitchen. The building we found was low and nondescript. The basement was very descript indeed, racks and racks of GPUs, their fans like 1,000 quiet insects. A woman with short hair and a night market t-shirt met us there, leaning on a broom as if we were a different kind of mess. She introduced herself as Grace. She was 19 with the underfed brightness of a teenager who had taught herself too much too fast. You posted the card, I said. You sent the texts. I'm Nightjar, she said, and then added with a shrug, one of them. Why? Kay asked, and his voice was not angry or hurt, but tired. We were trying to do this right. Grace rolled her eyes. You were trying, she said, and you were blind to the knives under the table. Do you think the clubs copied your renderer by accident? Do you think they found your off switch in the logs by chance? We located your partners. Sabrina's mouth tightened. We have no partners like that. Then you have shareholders with other businesses, Grace said, and they have proposals ready. Dream-tuned ad placements, nightly loyalty programs, sleep-time navigation of brand landscapes. Let us be the myth factory, one of them wrote. She spun her laptop around, showing an email that looked real even with names redacted. The subject line made my stomach ache. Monetizing Nocturne, the sleep economy. How did you get this? Sabrina asked. Not with math, Grace said. With people. I worked in their building as a cleaner. You're a cleaner? I said. I'm a cleaner, she said. I clean their caches and their floors. With her help, we mapped a web of interests that connected Yuansomnia's most vocal investor to a chain of entertainment companies and 2 clubs that offered Lucid Ladder under a different name. It wasn't enough for an indictment. It was more than enough for a reckoning. Liao? I asked Grace. She looked down. I tried to warn her, she said. I think they tried to recruit her. She wouldn't bend. Someone put a hush in her tea, one of those designer cholinergics that make the urge to talk slide off your tongue. She didn't die of that, she died of the quiet. It wasn't evidence. It was a narrative. But narratives often fit because people select their own glue. We left the basement with a copy of what Grace called Blue House, a folder of plans for a facility that would offer dream tuning to wealthy clients who didn't want the club's grime. The address was familiar. Near Tainan's salt pans, a low warehouse that kept the heat like a memory. That night, I did something I had avoided. I replayed my dream again. The corridor, the rain, my brother with the shaved ice, the jar of dried plums that didn't belong. This time, I asked Hypnos to show me the tags, green halos around invented details. The plums glowed. The spoon's handle glowed. The sound of Tamsui's tide had a faint ring around it, an invention atop a truth. And then I saw a glitch I had not seen. In the reflection on the gurney's stainless steel, the shape of the person watching me from the hall was wrong, too tall, a smudge where no smudge should be. A tag hung there too, then flickered. Show me the metadata, I said, and the UI complied, code clean, clinical. There was a noise in the reconstruction pipeline right as the watcher appeared, a stitch mark where palimpsest had swapped in a detail from a context set that had been labeled exogenous. I took off the headset and sat very still. Exogenous details are injected by a system when training data comes from outside the current session. They can be harmless, model priors, environment textures, but they can also be guides, memory cues aligned with user behavior. That requires permission or hubris. I walked to Key's office with the headset still warm in my hands. Why are there exogenous cues in my dream? I asked, not bothering to sit. Kay stood. There shouldn't be, he said. We switched that off after early tests. It was for research on dream stabilization. It was never meant to be in production. But it was in mine, I said. He looked ill. Early beta, he murmured to himself as much as to me. We were still migrating configs. Or someone turned it on, I said, because they needed me to see something, or not see something else. For the first time since I had met him, Key didn't look like a man playing a perfect game. He looked like a man who suddenly realized there was no game, only a field with hidden holes. Find Blue House, I said, before it finds us. Episode 3, Gardeners. Blue House stood white under Tainan's sunlight, which is a different animal than Taipei's. Cleaner, flatter, a light that shows your edges. The building was one of those low, expensive boxes designed by people who like their lines unbroken. The sign on the gate said Sleep Atelier in a modest font, the kind of lie that lays itself down to be stepped over. Sabrina had done the legal work to get us in, an inspection authorized under a privacy audit clause buried deep in a contract to which Blue House's shell company had agreed when it used Yuan Somnia's beta APISK came. Because his hands had built the machine that would be dissected, I came because I had promised the dead a shape. The reception smelled like air freshener and salt. A woman in a black dress guided us past rooms labeled curation, integration, and in a kind of hubris, only money permits, archetypes. In one room, a client reclined under a mesh not unlike Nocturne's crown, while a technician adjusted a panel of sliders labeled valence, agency, novelty, fidelity. On the wall, a graph showed the dream's predicted semantic density in a live wave form, as if meaning were amplitude you could tune like a radio. Where do you get your renderer? I asked lightly. We developed it in-house, the woman said, eyes not quite meeting mine. And the decoder? I asked. Licenses from various vendors, she said, smiling like a hostess folding napkins. In a small glass room filled with white light, we found what we had come for. A map of the building's signal architecture. It showed closed-loop pathways between the crown, a TFUS array, a haptic system embedded in the mattress, and a scent diffuser that could microdose aerosols. It wasn't just reading dreams, it was writing. This is illegal, Sabrina said, voice flat. You cannot stimulate in a clinical analog without explicit safety trials. It's not clinical, the woman said, sweet as poison. It's wellness. The map also showed an API call labeled guide, a function that accepted a vector in palimpsest's latent space with a small flag for implant. What's implant? I asked. Anchors, the technician said before the hostess could stop her. Cues that make certain content stick better in memory upon waking. It helps with therapy integration. Therapy, I repeated. Which therapist? Silence has temperatures. This one was body hot. We left with more than we needed. Logs of API calls, lists of compounds used in curated sessions, anonymized files that weren't anonymized nearly enough. Blue House's clients had signed consent forms so broad they were umbrellas over other umbrellas. They had let strangers into the rooms where their sleeping minds file themselves. In return, they got dreams like advertisements for their own desires. At a night market in Tainan, I ate a bowl of milkfish soup and told Kay about Wei, about the way the hospital had hummed that last night like a refrigerator, keeping a bitter secret. If someone had offered me a dream where I could say goodbye properly, I said, I would have taken it. I would have paid any price. He nodded. That's why this is dangerous, he said. They're selling forged goodbyes. I thought of Hui standing by the river, quiet as a monument. We flew back to Taipei, and I did the thing all investigators do when reality smells wrong. I went to the archive. 3 years before Nocturne, the hospital had participated in a study on sleep in comatose patients. The study's sponsor was a small biotech that had since been absorbed by an investment fund, which had, through a chain of shells, invested in yuansomnia. They had used non-invasive sensors in the ICU to track brain rhythms in the sedated and the dying, no more invasive than a pillow. The consent had been broad, because families in grief sign things. The data had been used to train early decoders. The hospital had asked me to consult peripherally because of my work and because my brother was a patient on that floor. I had said no. I had also slept on chairs in that ward, my head bent over my brother's bed rail, my exhaustion deep. Did they record me? I asked the archivist. As a control. She didn't know. The archive didn't have that precision. But she gave me a box with papers and a USB drive, and the look people give you when your objectivity collapses in front of them. I sat in a coffee shop and plugged in the drive. Logs bloomed, names blurred to initials. Timestamps clung to dates like barnacles. In one file, tagged Attendant 14, there was a pattern that looked like my sleep. Short N1s, solid N2s, bright REMs like flags. The associated label made my throat tight. Family. When I went back to my apartment that night, my living room felt staged. The couch, the bookshelf, the plant I always forgot to water. They were props in a room that had been observed. I lay on the floor and stared at the ceiling until the white became grey. The next morning, Kay didn't come to work. Sabrina said he was home with a fever. Avery said he was in a hotel, probably writing code until his eyes bled. Grace said he was dead. Not funny, I said. She wasn't smiling. There's a new post, she said, sending me a link. The Dream Bazaar had a fresh clip, and even in the thumbnail I recognized the ceiling. Kay's apartment. He lay on his bed with the mesh on, eyes under lids moving like fish under ice, mouth open in a small O. The dream itself was strange. He walked through a warehouse of sleeping bodies, each covered with a white sheet, each sheet imprinted with tiny texts. He paused by one and lifted the corner, but we never saw the face. He looked at the camera and said, "I'm so sorry," in a voice like someone confessing to a door. I called Gao. He pounded on Kay's door with the security guard and got no answer. He forced it. Kay wasn't there. On his kitchen table he had left a note in block letters. "I'll fix it." "Fix what?" Sabrina whispered, her composure cracking. "Everything," I said, "or nothing. That night I dreamed without help." In it I walked through Blue House's hallway, but the walls were paper, and people pressed their mouths to them from the other side, whispering my name. When I woke, I vomited bile into the sink, and then laughed at my own melodrama. If Kay had decided to fix it, there was only one way. To pull palimpsest apart and rebuild the bridge. And there was only one place he could do that fast. a server farm with GPUs and people who knew how to keep a man alive on noodles. Grace found his trace in Pingzhen, anonymous hardware but the same code habits, the same circular comments. He's going to strip exogenous cues from the renderer, she said, and introduce a watermark that can't be removed. He's also going to burn the guide API, or at least that's what the diff shows. Then why run? I asked. Because he's afraid, she said simply, of his investors, of you, of himself. Avery and I drove there because sometimes the only way to make the science stop humming is to put your body where the noise is. We found Key at dawn, hair matted, face like a man who had been crying without water. He saw me and did not look surprised. "I'm sorry," he said with the softness of a torn envelope, "for everything I didn't know." "Liao is dead," I said, because I had learned that grief makes people honest. "I know," he said. "I keep seeing her in my dreams. She tells me to stop playing God in the stupidest Jungian language." He smiled without humor. "But she's right." "Did you implant exogenous cues in my dream?" I asked. "In the demo." He closed his eyes. "Yes," he said. "I left the flag on by accident. Then I left it on purpose. I wanted you to see the fidelity and to believe. It wasn't a manipulation in the evil sense. It was salesmanship. Which is worse sometimes because you call yourself good while you trim reality." "And the ICU data?" I asked. He opened his eyes, and in them I finally saw something unattractive. Rationalization spent, and nothing left to cover it. "We trained a map of sleep with any consenting data we could find," he said. "The hospital consent was technically adequate. We didn't target you. We swallowed the ocean, and you were a molecule in it." "You built a machine that turns mourning into a subscription," I said. He nodded. "I built a machine that could have been a cathedral and became a mall." "What now?" I asked. "I burned them all," he said. "I released the watermark code and the forensic tools. I confess," he laughed, a short, ugly sound. "And then I go to jail or to Silicon Valley, which is worse." We drove back to Taipei with a drive full of commits and a man who looked a decade older. On the way, Grace texted, "Blue House is emptying. The investors are moving the rigs." "Call Gao," I told Avery. "Tell him to stall them with permits." "And you?" he asked. "I'm going to the river," I said. Hui was standing on the bike path where she always stood, the water moving like a thought you can't drop. "Do you remember me?" I asked, and she turned her head like a flower following the sun. "Yes," she said. "You're the one who took away my flute." She meant it kindly. "What do you see when you come here?" I asked. "Silence," she said, "and a feeling like when you wake up before an alarm and steal a minute." "Does your husband worry?" I asked. "He stays with me," she said, and I looked and saw a man on a bench, asleep, mouth open. "You'll be okay," I said, and I meant it less as a statement than a plea. The water did not reply. Episode 4, Latency. It took 48 hours for Kay's confession to bloom and rot. He recorded a video in which he told the story of palimpsest and hypnos and all the good intentions that paved their road. He released the watermark code and a forensic tool that could detect guide implants in replays. He named the investors who had tried to push Yuansomnia into the sleep economy. Then he did something none of us expected. He named me. He explained the ICU study and my proximity, the control logs that might include my sleep. He said my early demo had included exogenous cues, that he had left the flag on, and that I had caught it. He apologized to me by name, which felt like someone shouting my secrets in a market. My phone melted. The press wanted my brother's story. They wanted me to cry on camera. They wanted to pull the thread of my grief until the sweater came apart. I refused to participate. Sabrina issued a statement. The hospital called its lawyers. The investors screamed at everyone and then at each other. Nightjar posted a clip of a jar of dried plums with a green halo around it and said nothing. And Blue House moved. Gao's permits bought us time, but not enough. The rigs were headed for a port. Their route took them past a nondescript warehouse near Taoyuan, where one of the investor's other companies staged shipments. Grace, who had traded cleaning for driving, texted, "They're here." I went with Gao and a small squad from the police whose names I still don't know because sometimes anonymity is the best armor. We entered the warehouse like a tide sneaking up on a beach. The servers were hot, their lights as indifferent as stars. A man in a suit tried to show us a stack of documents with stamps. Gao smiled at him like a wolf. In a room that hummed exactly like all rooms full of GPUs hum, we found something else. A chamber with a crown, a TFUS rig, and a reclining chair. On the chair was a woman asleep with the mesh on. The display beside her showed valence high, fidelity high, agency low. The storm that came up my spine had a Latin name. "Wake her," I said. A technician stammered something about protocols. I leaned over and touched the woman's hand. "Ma'am," I said, "you're in a place where you haven't agreed to be." Her eyes fluttered open. She wore the expression of a person plucked out of a dream and held up to a fluorescent light. "Where is the river?" she murmured, and I felt the tile shift under my feet. We shut Blue House down. We impounded the servers. We escorted the sleeping clients to actual beds. We executed a search order on the investors' offices and found more emails than a fire could destroy. The legal cases would take years. I had done my part. It should have ended there with statements and courts and slow public ugliness, but plots with true gravity swing until they snap. 2 days later, Sabrina was attacked in her car by a man who claimed to be a victim of dream theft. He threw a jar of dried plums through her windshield. It did not kill her. It only made the metaphor tiresome. The man was arrested. He had 6 dream clips in his pocket. He had a printout of a manifesto that looked nothing like Nightjar's clean anger, and everything like a chalkboard full of rant. "People are losing their minds," Avery said to me. "We showed them their night, and now the day is thin." He wasn't wrong. The city developed a new kind of insomnia. Some people refused to sleep without Nocturne. Others refused to sleep with it in the world. Sales of old-fashioned wristwatches surged because they promised to measure only time. Therapists split into camps: the integrators, who believed replay was a gift if used gently; the purists, who believed nothing good could come from turning dreams into artifacts; and the gardeners, who believed dream curation could be a form of art therapy if guarded like plutonium. The entertainment industry found the edge of the cliff but did not jump, having watched our fires. Insomnia survived as a smaller thing. Sabrina stayed, which surprised me until I watched her walk through a staff meeting with the calm of someone who had known worse men. Avery did not resign. He took to wearing a little pin with a nightbird on it, a private penance. Kay was charged, as were the investors. The courtroom was a theater where nothing particularly surprising happened. I remained a detective because the world always has use for one. The cases that came to me were now more likely to smell of sleep. A teenage boy assaulted a classmate after a curated dream led him to believe she had confessed to loving him. A CEO claimed his board had implanted a fear of heights to keep him out of helicopters. A writer accused a rival of stealing his dream's plot. They were all hard, and in each one the question was the same. What is a dream? And is a captured dream the same kind of thing? When is a memory a device? When is a desire a product? One night, after too much sake and too little distance from my thoughts, I took the headset out of its case. I had not replayed since the investigation. My brother had remained where he belonged, gone mostly and unbearably still inside me. I turned the device on, but before I started, I changed one setting. I disabled replay. It felt like standing at a door I would not open. Instead, I scrolled through diagnostic. Palimpsest updated in the months since our war. The tag system had changed. Invented details now had borders like old stamps, and exogenous cues had their own color and a chime that could be made audible. The watermark lived in the edges, a pattern a forensic tool could pull like a thread. The guide API was gone. I did something small. I added to my consent profile a new clause that said, No exogenous cues, no retention beyond aggregate statistics, no sharing without a private key I keep in a box at my mother's house. It was mostly symbolic. The company had already implemented these policies by default. But sometimes symbols are the only laws that stick. And then I slept without the crown. In the dream that came, I walked in a corridor that was an alley that was a kitchen. The rain came down in sheets. My brother sat on a gurney and offered me a spoonful of shaved ice. I laughed and said no because my mouth was already blue. He smiled, and his eyes were the deepest black. And behind him on the counter there was no jar of dried plums, only the light coming through the window, a pale, clean square. I woke with the feeling you have when you find a coin in the laundry, the small, unpurchased joy of it. In the morning I met Grace in a cafe in Gongguan. She had started a cooperative with other nightjars, Dream Commons, a set of tools for self-hosting, for genuine deletion, for audit. Their manifesto was more boring than their previous ones, which is how you know people are growing up. They proposed a right to dream that included the right to not be recorded, the right to hold your own keys, the right to know when your night had been invaded, and the right to repair the machines that mediate it. People will ignore us, she said, sipping coffee that had gone cold while she fought with her code. Until they don't, I said. Until they need you. She grinned. You sound like a therapist, she said. God forbid, I said. I'm a detective. I prefer my wounds superficial. We watched a couple at the next table argue in whispers about whether to sign their child up for a sleep study that would diagnose ADHD in a night. The world had moved under our feet. Before she left, Grace pulled a small black card from her pocket and slid it across the table. On it, the nightbird. Underneath, a sentence. Dreams belong to dreamers. She had added in a shaky hand and to no one else. On the way home, under a sky that threatened rain without delivering it, I passed a shop window where a VR headset sat like an idol. My reflection floated behind it. In the glass, a palm tree and a row of scooters overlapped my face like the overlays in palimpsest. For once, it made me laugh. In the months that followed, the city adjusted. Couples wrote dream contracts like prenuptials. Therapists invented protocols with little bells that rang when a memory cross-contaminated the present. Students studied less with their heads and more with their nights. Some people made art that could only have been made by someone who had stood inside their own museum. Some simply slept better, having admitted their monsters into daylight and found them smaller than they feared. Not everyone healed, no one ever does, but enough did to keep me hopeful. On the anniversary of my brother's death, I went to Tamsui and sat by the river. The water was the right color, green-brown with a skin of light. I did not bring Nocturne. I did not bring any machine at all. I brought a cup of shaved ice from a stall that had no name and ate it slowly, letting the peanuts stick in my teeth. A moth bumped my knee with the enthusiasm of a drunk friend and fell into the grass. I closed my eyes and listened to the tide lap. Somewhere a kid played a flute badly. I smiled. In a world where we can make our nights into artifacts, I had found one thing holy, the small private space between a breath and its echo, the place where a neurologist turned detective stops measuring, stops inferring, stops proving, and simply watches her own brain hum like a street at dusk. The devices will get better. The laws will stumble after them. The markets will circle and recede. The therapy doctrines will metastasize and then mature. People will continue to be people, hungry, tender, foolish, brave. They will dream. They will buy and sell and share and hoard their dreams. Some will weaponize them. Some will use them as bridges across the worst parts of their lives. Most will use them as nights, a place to put the day down so you can pick it up again without dropping it. As for me, I will keep my keys in a box at my mother's house. I will wear the crown when I need to understand a patient who has become my client. I will refuse it when I need to remember who I am without witnesses. And on certain rain-bright nights I will sleep like we used to, undefended, unrecorded, undirected, and trust that the ancient machine in my head still knows how to make meaning without being watched. Epilogue. Notes from a Working Life on Technical Grounding. Nocturne's promise rested on the harmonizing of disparate sensors, quantum diamond magnetometers, QDMS, for near-field magnetic flux, optical measures of hemoglobin oxygenation, NIRS, for slow metabolic shifts, EEG for global phase dynamics, into a single multi-scale vector that could be fed into a generative model. The elegance was not in any one instrument, but in their synchronization and in the learned mapping, palimpsest, from brain dynamics to the latent manifold of a learned world model, hypnos. When reconstructions hallucinated, it was because the manifold needed to fill in missing texture with plausible priors. We learned to tag those priors. The lesson generalized: mark your interpolations. On closed-loop stimulation, Bluehouse's crime wasn't only reading, it was writing, using TFUS to bias thalamocortical loops at REM/N2 boundaries, using haptics and scent to connect state transitions to content. Done crudely, this rearranges consolidation like a bully rearranges schoolbooks. Done carefully, this can help trauma release its grip. The difference is not only dosage and timing, it's consent and purpose. On designer dreaming, the lucid ladder phenomenon taught us that the mind is not a canvas for anyone who can afford paint. Cholinergic upregulation, orexin modulation, and clever cues can increase vividness and agency, but they also increase suggestibility. In therapy, that's a tool. In entertainment, that's a product liability lawsuit wearing a velvet jacket. On privacy, end-to-end is a phrase that melts in heat. Our PPG-derived key scheme died as a cautionary tale. The new standards, user-held keys, forensic watermarks, public verification of implant-free replays, grew from our bruises. The right to dream, even to forget, had to be framed like a right, not a preference. On human consequences, some patients healed faster when they could revisit their night under supervision and adjust its weight. Some got trapped in curated loops, their waking lives paling. The social fabric stretched, new etiquette, don't show your dream of me without asking, and new crimes, sleep blackmail, implant fraud, dream plagiarism. My job became to trace intention through a medium that had always felt immune to law. It wasn't. Nothing human is. If there is a central truth I carry into every case, it is this: a machine that can mirror a mind is a machine that can mislead it. The fixes are not only technical, they are moral, procedural, communal. Put tags on inventions, put locks on vaults and give keys to their owners. Put humility in design documents and enforce it like a spec. And then, because we must, put the headset down sometimes. Leave a little of the night untouched. That, more than any watermark or clause, is what will keep us from turning our interior life into whatever we can sell it for.